The air in the mountain's throat was cold stone and old silence. Ilara's breath plumed white, a fleeting ghost in the beam of her lantern. Beside her, Kale, a dog of indeterminate breed and steadfast loyalty, shifted his weight from one paw to the other, his claws making a soft scraping sound on the granite floor. His intelligent eyes, the color of burnt honey, watched her, not with impatience, but with the quiet companionship of a shared purpose. The rhythmic strike of her pickaxe was the only heartbeat in the darkness. Chip, ring, scrape. Each impact sent a jarring echo down the 50 feet of tunnel she had already carved from the guts of Mount Cinder. Her hands, wrapped in worn leather, were a geography of calluses and blisters, but the muscles in her arms and back had hardened into something resilient, something that no longer burned with every swing. This was her inheritance, a half-finished hole in a mountain. A stack of leather-bound journals filled with her father's elegant, spidery script, and the conviction that he had not been a madman. Outside, the late autumn sun was beginning its descent, painting the valley in hues of rust and gold. From her vantage point, 1,000 feet above the town of Silver Creek, the settlement looked like a collection of children's blocks scattered in the fold of the hills. She could hear the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer and the lowing of cattle being brought in for the evening. They knew she was up here. The strange girl, the orphan, chipping away at the mountain face like a demented woodpecker. A tomb, Mr. Silas Blackwood had declared a month ago, his voice echoing with the authority of a man whose wealth was tied to every timber frame and mercantile in the valley. He had ridden his fine gray mare up the switchback trail, his face a mask of condescending pity. "You're digging your own tomb, girl. Your father lost his mind after your mother passed, and it seems you've inherited his affliction. This mountain will be your coffin." Ilara had simply wiped sweat from her brow with the back of a gritty glove and looked at him. "I have a plan." "A plan?" He had laughed, a short barking sound that spooked a jay from a nearby pine. "Winter will seal that hole with 30 feet of snow. The rock will sweat ice until the ceiling collapses. That's not a plan, child. That's a tragedy in the making." Kale had let out a low growl, a rumble that started deep in his chest. Ilara placed a hand on his neck, and the sound subsided. She did not argue. Her father's journals had taught her the futility of arguing with men who believed their opinions were facts. You did not persuade them with words. You persuaded them with work. You persuaded them with survival. Mrs. Gable, whose kindness was as vast and smothering as her Sunday shawls, had brought her a basket of bread and stew 2 weeks prior. "Ilara, dear," she'd pleaded, her brow furrowed with genuine concern. "Come down to town. We can find you a place. You can't stay up here alone. It isn't right. That tunnel, it breathes a coldness that isn't natural." "It'll be warm," Ilara had said, accepting the food with a quiet nod of thanks. "The doors will see to that." Even Jedediah, the old trapper who lived on the neighboring ridge and knew the mountain's moods better than any man alive, had shaken his head in disbelief. He'd watched her felling the great pines from the north slope, limbing them, and dragging them with a block and tackle to the tunnel entrance. "That's good timber," he'd conceded, chewing on a piece of dried jerky. "But you're setting your braces all wrong. The weight of the mountain shifts. You need cross beams every 4 feet, not 10. She'll crush them like twigs come the first big freeze." "The arches will hold the weight," she replied, pointing to the curved design in her father's journal, a sketch of interlocking timbers that distributed the load outward, not downward. It was a principle of engineering he'd learned from a book about ancient aqueducts. Jedediah had squinted at the drawing, then back at her. "That's the craziest thing I've ever seen. Wait until winter. You'll see." Now, in the fading light, she set down her pickaxe and ran a hand along the cool, rough-hewn rock. 52 feet. Her father had managed 30 before the sickness took him. She had added 22 more in the 4 months since his passing. He had wanted to go straight through the narrowest part of the ridge, a passage of nearly 400 feet that would connect their isolated homestead on the west face with the valley trail on the east. A winter road, he'd called it, a way to get supplies and mail when the high pass was buried. But the journals revealed a deeper purpose. He had studied weather patterns, ice cores from the glacier on the peak, and the rings of ancient, fallen trees. He saw a cycle, a pattern of escalating severity in the winter storms that the valley's short memory had forgotten. He wasn't just building a road, he was building a refuge. Cale nudged her hand with his cold nose, and she smiled, the expression feeling foreign on her face. She followed him to the entrance. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of frost. Below, the first lamps were being lit in Silver Creek, tiny sparks of yellow against the encroaching blue of twilight. They saw a girl digging a hole. She saw a lifeline. She picked up a length of timber, the wood resinous and heavy on her shoulder, and carried it into the darkness. The work was not finished. The days shortened, and the work grew harder. The granite became denser, interspersed with veins of quartz that fought the pickaxe with a stubborn, ringing defiance. Elara learned to read the rock, to find its weaknesses, to follow the fissures that made the labor a fraction easier. Her world shrank to the tunnel, to the scent of stone dust and her own sweat, to the amber glow of the lantern, and to the silent, watchful presence of Cale. He would lie for hours just inside the entrance, a furry sentinel, his ears twitching at the sound of a distant rockfall or the cry of a hawk. He was her compass, her clock, her only confidant. She spent a full week on the timbering. Following her father's diagrams, she cut and notched the 10-foot lengths of pine, fitting them into the curved arches that Jedediah had dismissed. She used a hand-cranked winch to hoist the heavy ridge beams into place, her muscles screaming with the effort. When the first arch was complete, she stood back and admired it. It looked delicate, almost skeletal. But when she hung her full weight from the keystone, it didn't so much as groan. It was a structure of tension and balance, not brute force. It was elegant. It would hold. She built 12 of them, spaced precisely 10 feet apart, creating a ribbed wooden spine inside the mountain's stone body. Between the arches, she wedged shorter planks, creating a solid wooden ceiling that felt safer, warmer than the raw rock above. Then came the ventilation shafts. This was the part that had earned her father the most ridicule. 2 small, 2-foot square shafts, carved not straight up, but at a 30-degree angle, emerging on the mountainside 100 feet above the main entrance. The townspeople saw them as an invitation for snow and wind. Her father, in his journals, had explained their true purpose with meticulous diagrams. The angle would prevent snow from drifting in, while a simple stone cowl at the top would deflect the wind. They were chimneys, designed to draw smoke from a fire inside while pulling in fresh, breathable air. A tunnel without airflow, he wrote, is just a grave waiting for a body. Carving them was perilous work. She had to build a scaffold inside the tunnel and work overhead, dust and rock chips raining down on her. Cale would sit at the bottom, whining softly with concern as she worked. Twice she lost her footing, saved only by the rope she had tied around her waist. Her knuckles were raw, her face smudged with grime, but when the final cut was made and a sliver of pale blue sky appeared, she felt a surge of triumph that was more potent than any food or rest. As autumn deepened, she turned her attention to the doors. They had to be massive, strong enough to resist the pressure of a blizzard's drift, yet insulated enough to hold in the heat. She built them in sections inside the tunnel, using the timbered space as her workshop. She constructed 2 layers of thick pine planks, leaving a 6-inch gap between them, which she painstakingly filled with dried moss and sheep's wool she had gathered over the summer. The result was a pair of doors, each 5 feet wide and 9 feet tall, and nearly a foot thick. The hinges were the greatest challenge. No ordinary hardware would suffice. Using her father's small, makeshift forge near the entrance, she heated and hammered scrap iron, salvaged from an old wagon, into massive strap hinges, each 4 feet long. The work was brutal, loud, and blisteringly hot. She learned the language of the metal, the cherry-red glow that meant it was ready to be shaped, the dull gray that warned it was becoming brittle. When she finally hung the first door, using the winch and a series of levers to maneuver the immense weight, the groan of the iron on the huge pintle was a sound of victory. It fit perfectly, swinging shut with a solid, satisfying thud that sealed the darkness and silenced the wind. Leanne was the first person from the town who approached her without pity or scorn. He was a carpenter, a young man with quiet hands and an observant gaze. He came up the trail one afternoon carrying 2 steaming mugs. He offered one to her. It was hot cider, spiced with cinnamon. "I saw the joinery on your arches," he said, his voice calm and direct. "It's a mortise and tenon, but I've never seen it used in a curve like that. It's clever." Clara, unused to praise, merely nodded, her throat tight. She took a sip of the cider. It was warm and sweet. "They say you're digging a tomb," he continued, looking not at her, but at the tunnel entrance. "But tombs don't have chimneys." He gestured with his mug toward the small, cowled vents high on the mountainside. "They're for ventilation," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. "For a fire," he surmised. "You plan to winter in there." "If I have to." He was silent for a long moment, studying the massive, wool-stuffed door she was building. He ran a hand over the smooth-planed wood. "This is good work, Clara. My grandfather would have admired this work." He finished his cider, handed her the empty mug, and gave a small, respectful nod. "Be safe." Then he turned and walked back down the path. He did not offer advice. He did not call her a fool. He had simply seen the work for what it was. His visit was a small crack of light in her solitary world. By the time the first snows came, dusting the peaks in a delicate layer of white, the tunnel was complete. 187 feet long, 10 feet wide, and 12 feet high at the apex of the arches. The second door was hung, a mirror image of the first. Inside, she had built a small stone fire pit directly beneath the main ventilation shaft. Along one wall, she had stacked a formidable amount of firewood, cut, split, and dried over the summer. Enough, she calculated, to last 3 months of continuous burning. On the other side were shelves, neatly stocked with sacks of flour, beans, dried meat, and tins of preserved fruit. There were blankets, extra lanterns, and a large cask of fresh water she'd filled from the mountain spring. Silas Blackwood made one final visit. He didn't dismount this time, just reined in his horse at the edge of the clearing. The project that had been a mad girl's folly was now a finished, tangible thing. A great wooden mouth set into the stone face of the mountain. He couldn't deny the craftsmanship, but it only seemed to deepen his contempt. "So you finished your monument to foolishness," he called out, his voice sharp in the cold, thin air. "A fine-looking mausoleum, I'll grant you. When they find your frozen bodies in the spring, at least you'll be buried in a well-built coffin." Clara was banking the earth around the tunnel's foundation. She didn't look up. Cale, lying nearby, did not even bother to growl. They were used to the noise. "It isn't a coffin," she said, her voice flat and even. "It's a shelter." He scoffed and wheeled his horse around. "We'll see what the mountain has to say about that." The first month of winter was gentle. The snow fell in soft, picturesque layers. The town of Silver Creek settled into its winter rhythms. The cold was a familiar companion, not an enemy. Ilara and Kale lived in the small cabin her father had built, connected to the tunnel by a short, covered walkway. They were comfortable. She spent her days checking her trap lines, reading her father's books by the fire, and maintaining the tunnel, ensuring the doors swung freely and the vents were clear. The town mostly forgot about her, the mountain tunnel fading into a piece of local folklore, a story to tell newcomers about the strange girl on the West Ridge. Then, the sky began to change. It started subtly. The quality of the light became thin and yellow, like old parchment. The wind, which usually came from the west, shifted, now blowing in uneasy gusts from the northeast, carrying a deep, penetrating chill that had nothing to do with the ambient temperature. Jedediah, visiting to trade some beaver pelts for her smoked trout, paused on his way out, sniffing the air like a hound. "That's a snow wind," he muttered, his eyes narrowed as he scanned the oddly placid sky. "But there's something else behind it. Something I don't know." He looked at her, then at the tunnel. "You keep that woodpile high, girl." Kale felt it too. He grew restless, pacing the cabin, his ears perked. He would stand at the door, a low whine in his throat, his nose pressed to the crack, tasting the shifting air. Ilara trusted his instincts more than any weather report. She spent 2 days hauling the last of her cut firewood into the tunnel, filling every available space. She double-checked the seals on the doors, packing the edges with strips of canvas. She brought Kale's bedding, her own spare mattress, and a large pot for melting snow into the shelter. She was preparing not for a storm, but for a siege. The snow began on a Tuesday afternoon. It wasn't the familiar fat flakes of a valley storm, but a fine, hard powder, like sifted sugar, driven by a wind that didn't howl so much as hiss. By nightfall, the world outside her cabin window was a churning vortex of white. The wind's hiss grew into a shriek, a high, keening sound that seemed to scrape at the very bones of the mountain. Ilara moved herself and Kale into the tunnel. She swung the massive inner door shut. The shriek of the wind was instantly muted to a low moan. She secured the heavy iron bar across it. Walking through the lantern-lit space, the air still and cold, she reached the outer door and did the same. The silence that followed was absolute. It was profound. Outside, a tempest was tearing the world apart. Inside, there was only the soft hiss of her lantern and the sound of her own breathing. She lit a small, controlled fire in the stone pit. The smoke, thin and gray, was immediately drawn up the ventilation shaft, a perfect, steady column of air. Not a wisp of it clouded the tunnel. A slow, steady draft of fresh, cold air trickled from the second vent, feeding the flames. Her father's design was working flawlessly. She spread out their blankets near the fire, and Kale curled up, sighing as the first wave of warmth reached him. He looked at her, his tail giving a single, trusting thump on the woolen fabric. For the first time in hours, he seemed at peace. The tomb was warm. The tomb was quiet. The tomb was safe. For 3 days, they lived in the mountain's embrace. Ilara kept the fire small, but constant. She melted snow for water, cooked simple meals of beans and jerky, and read by the light of the fire and lantern. The tunnel held the heat remarkably well. The thick wooden walls and insulated doors created a space that was cool at the far end, but comfortably warm near the center. The only indication of the blizzard outside was the relentless, low moan of the wind pressing against the doors, and the occasional deep whump as a load of snow slid from the rock face above. She had no idea how bad it was. She only knew that they were secure. On the 4th day, a new sound intruded. A frantic, desperate pounding on the outer door. Kale shot to his feet, a volley of sharp barks echoing in the enclosed space. Ilara quieted him with a hand and listened. It wasn't the wind. It was a human fist. "Hello!" A voice screamed, thin and reedy against the storm. "Is anyone in there? Please, help us!" Her heart hammered against her ribs. She grabbed her heavy coat, unbarred the door, and pulled. It resisted, heavy with the weight of a massive drift. She put her shoulder into it, pushing with all her strength until it opened a crack, letting in a blast of blinding white snow and ferocious cold. Framed in the opening was Leanne, his face masked in ice, his eyes wide with fear. Behind him, cowering in the lee of the rock face, were his parents and his younger sister, their forms barely visible in the maelstrom. "Ilara," he gasped, his voice cracking. "The roof of our workshop. It collapsed. We had nowhere to go. I remembered. I hoped." "Get inside," she said, her voice steady. She pulled the door wider, and they stumbled in, collapsing onto the stone floor, shivering violently. Ilara shoved the door closed against the storm, the silence descending once more. Leanne's little sister, no older than 7, was crying silently, her face pale with cold and shock. Ilara wrapped her in one of the thickest blankets and sat her by the fire. She handed out mugs of hot, sweet tea she'd brewed. Leanne's father, a man who had always looked at her with polite skepticism, now stared around the tunnel in stunned disbelief. He touched the timbered arches, the smooth wooden walls, the neat stacks of supplies. It's warm," he stammered, "and the air is clear." "The vents," Leanne said, pointing upward. "I told you." They were only the first. An hour later, more pounding came. It was Jedediah, the old trapper, half carrying his wife. The roof of his barn had given way, and his cabin was buried to the eaves. He looked at Ilara, his face grim, all traces of his former mockery gone. "The wind," he said, his voice a low rasp. "It's not a valley wind. It's coming down off the glacier. I've never seen its like. My cabin, built to stand for 100 years. The walls are cracking." He looked around the tunnel, his experienced eyes taking in every detail of the construction. He ran a hand over the curved arch above him. "The weight," he whispered, to himself more than to her. "It pushes it together. It makes it stronger." He finally met her gaze. "Your father was a wise man, girl. Wiser than any of us." Throughout the day they came, a trickle, then a stream of desperate, half-frozen refugees from Silver Creek. The Gable family arrived, Mrs. Gable's face a mess of tears and frozen sleet. She hugged Ilara, her smothering kindness now a raw, desperate gratitude. "We thought we were going to die, child. The snow is up to the second-story windows. The church roof is gone." The town blacksmith and his family, the school teacher, the mercantile owner. One by one, the families whose homes had been breached or destroyed made the treacherous journey up the trail, a path that was now a deep trench in the snow, guided by the faint glow of Ilara's lantern which she had hung just outside the entrance. Each arrival brought a new story of devastation, roofs collapsing under unimaginable weight, walls imploding from the force of the wind. The creek, frozen solid, was now a featureless plain of white. The town was being erased. By nightfall, the tunnel was filled with people. 63 souls, huddled together in the warm, still air. Children slept wrapped in blankets, their faces finally relaxed. Adults spoke in hushed, awe-filled tones, their eyes constantly scanning the impossible shelter that had saved them. The last to arrive was Silas Blackwood. He was alone, his fine clothes torn, his face bleeding from a long scratch on his cheek. His great house, the largest and best built in the valley, with its stone foundation and thick timber walls, had failed him. A massive pine, felled by the wind, had crushed the entire east wing. He stood just inside the door, snow melting in pools around his boots, his arrogance stripped away, leaving only a hollowed-out man. He surveyed the scene, the families he employed, the people who looked to him for leadership, all of them safe and warm in the one place he had condemned. His eyes found Alara, who was quietly handing a piece of dried apple to Leanne's little sister. He walked toward her, his steps heavy. The quiet conversation ceased. Everyone watched. He stopped before her, a giant of a man made small by the storm and his own short-sightedness. "I called this a tomb," Silas Blackwood said, his voice raw and broken. He had to clear his throat to continue. "I said you were digging a coffin." He looked around at the faces of his neighbors, at the sleeping children. "I was wrong." He looked back at Alara, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "This isn't a tomb. It's an ark. And you are its builder. Can you spare a blanket? My wife and son are right behind me." Alara simply nodded. She turned to her stack of supplies, pulled out 3 of her remaining blankets, and handed them to him without a word. Just then, more figures appeared at the door, Blackwood's family, and behind them 2 more families, bringing the total number of survivors inside the tunnel to 70. 70 people and 1 dog, sheltered in the heart of the mountain, listening to the storm rage outside, their lives preserved by the quiet, stubborn work of a girl they had called a fool. The blizzard lasted 2 more days. Inside the tunnel, a strange community formed. Fear gave way to a quiet, shared purpose. The women organized the food, making the meager supplies stretch to feed everyone. The men took turns tending the fire and checking the door for drifts. Jedediah and Leanne's father, both skilled woodsmen, examined every inch of Alara's construction, their conversation a low murmur of technical admiration. Silas Blackwood, stripped of his authority, was quiet and helpful, carrying water and comforting crying children. Alara moved among them, a calm center in the displaced crowd. She showed them how the vents worked, how to bank the fire to conserve wood, where the driest blankets were stored. She spoke little, but her presence was a constant, reassuring anchor. They had doubted her, but now they trusted her completely. This was her space, governed by her knowledge, and in it they had found salvation. When the wind finally died and an eerie silence fell, the men unbarred the outer door. It took 4 of them to push it open against the immense drift. The light that flooded the tunnel was blinding, a pure, painful white reflected off a world remade. The valley was gone. In its place was a rolling ocean of snow, 30 feet deep in places, sculpted by the wind into alien shapes. The tops of the tallest pines were visible, and the spire of the church, but the town of Silver Creek had vanished beneath the white blanket. Only a few stovepipes, sticking out like black straws, marked where homes had been. The destruction was absolute. A collective gasp went through the crowd gathered at the entrance. They were alive, but they were homeless. They had survived the storm, but now they had to survive its aftermath. In the weeks that followed, the tunnel became the heart of the new world. It was the only large, intact structure left. It served as a barracks, a town hall, a hospital. Under Jedediah's direction, the men began digging out the town, a monumental task that took weeks. They found homes crushed, possessions destroyed, but miraculously, because so many had made it to the tunnel, no one in Silver Creek had perished. The story of their survival spread as contact was re-established with the outside world. The tale of Blackwood's blizzard and Alara's tunnel became a regional legend. Engineers and architects came to study the tunnel's construction, marveling at the arched timbering and the ingenious ventilation system. Her father's journals, which Alara shared freely, were copied and studied, their unconventional wisdom suddenly recognized as genius. Silas Blackwood, a changed man, used his remaining wealth to fund the rebuilding of the town, but this time the construction followed new principles. Homes were built with steeper roofs and reinforced frames. A community shelter, a larger version of Alara's tunnel, was dug into the hillside near the town center. Alara, no longer the strange outcast, was a respected teacher, consulted on every aspect of the rebuilding. She worked alongside Leanne, their quiet partnership blossoming into a deep and abiding love. They were married the following summer, at the entrance to the tunnel, the entire town in attendance. Jedediah, who had become her fiercest advocate, gave her away. "Your father would be proud," he whispered to her, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just of the tunnel, of you." Years passed. The seasons turned, each winter a reminder of the great storm. But the town was prepared, secure. The tunnel, now formally known as the Ridgeback Passage, was reinforced with stone and became a vital artery for the community, a safe winter road just as her father had envisioned. It was a monument not to fear, but to foresight. Alara and Leanne built a new house on the site of her old cabin. They raised 3 children, teaching them the ways of the mountain, the importance of listening to the wind, and the value of patient, persistent work. Cale grew old, his muzzle turning gray, his steps becoming slower. He spent his final years sleeping by the hearth, his dreams filled with the scent of stone dust and the echo of a pickaxe. One spring morning, Alara found him lying in his favorite patch of sun, having passed peacefully in his sleep. She buried him on the hillside overlooking the tunnel entrance, under a small stone marker. He had been her first believer, her steadfast witness. His loss was a quiet, deep ache, a turning of a page in the book of her life. More years turned into decades. Alara grew old herself. Her hands, once a map of calluses, became gnarled with age, but they were still gentle when holding her grandchildren. Her hair turned the color of the winter snow. She was the matriarch of the valley, a living legend, though she never spoke of the blizzard unless asked. She didn't need to. The tunnel spoke for her. She died in her 87th year, on a calm winter evening, sitting in her chair by the window, looking out at the mountain she knew so intimately. Her passing was as peaceful as Cale's had been. The entire valley mourned her. They laid her to rest beside her faithful dog, near the entrance to the great work of her life. Silas Blackwood's grandson, the new mayor, commissioned a bronze plaque to be placed on the rock beside the massive wooden doors. It did not list her accomplishments or tell the story of the storm. It held just 5 words, an echo of what his grandfather had said in his moment of humbled realization, a phrase that had become the valley's epitaph for its quiet hero. It read, "She built a cradle here." The tunnel endured. It outlived its builder and all who had sheltered within it. It became a landmark, a permanent feature of the landscape, its dark, timbered mouth a testament to the stubborn, quiet girl who listened to the wisdom of the past and carved a future from the heart of a mountain. The wind still howled over the high passes in winter, but in the valley of Silver Creek, the sound was different now. It was no longer a threat, but a lullaby, the mountain breathing a long, slow sigh around the safe, warm, and enduring silence of Alara's passage.